There are days when we are stopped in our tracks. Days like last Monday, when we were going about our busyness, and someone said something that most of us never expected. The voice came over the television or the radio and said, "There is a tornado on the ground. Seek shelter now." Or maybe, like me, you were busy when that tornado blew through Moore, and you heard about it later. This was a major tornado, folks, they said, maybe as much as a mile wide. And it hit 2 elementary schools straight on. And because for most of us, most of the time, we are busy with our lives, when something like that breaks through, we hear only part of what was said. And the only thing we can think is, he said what? It's been a week full of moments that have stopped me in my tracks. A week when I was deeply reminded that disasters have a way of bringing out the worst in bad theologies. Maybe you heard them too. Not long ago, someone was asking me about this balancing act we do. We say we are a free faith, an open-hearted faith where everyone is welcome. But he'd noticed that sometimes we seem to take a stance that draws some views out. And we take a stance against things that are abhorrent, even when that means telling someone that their beliefs are dangerous or hurtful. Perhaps you heard these things this week. Well, God must have needed a few more angels in heaven. That's why he took those kids at Plaza Towers. Or those people just weren't praying hard enough. If they'd been praying harder, that tornado would have taken a turn for another direction. Or maybe you caught Wolf Blitzer on national television getting caught in an assumption about what Oklahomans believe. He was speaking to a survivor of the tornado in Moore, a woman whose whole family had made it through. And he said, "You got to thank the Lord, right? Do you thank the Lord for that split-second decision?" The woman hesitated for a moment, trying to figure out what the polite thing to say would be. Then she looked back at him, smiled this sort of awkward smile, and said, "Actually, I'm an atheist." And in that moment, I actually think there were 2 very different experiences of "he said what" going on. For many of us, the question was to ask of Wolf Blitzer, "He said what?" Why would he assume she'd be talking about a particular theological response instead of just being grateful for what was? But I also figure Wolf Blitzer was also having one of those moments. He could barely stubble out his response, "You are?" "All right," he responded, "but you made the right call." So we are called as a people, right? We're called as a people to be prepared to respond to moments like these, moments when the unexpected happens. To be able to remind people that sometimes when they rush to proffer up an answer that seems shallow or hurtful, they are not just asking the wrong question. They're also getting the wrong answer because they started in the wrong place. The problem with these answers is not just that they ignore how hurtful they are to those whose loved ones did not make it through. The problem that comes with suggesting that somehow it is the fault of those who have died, that they did not make it. Or worse, perhaps, that they should just simply shelve their grief away, because this is all part of some greater plan. And there's no need for them to just be sad. The problem with these answers is that they come from asking the wrong question in the first place. The response that we need when we are faced with moments that stop us in our tracks, moments that make us say, "He said what?" is not to ask why bad things happen, but to ask what. What are we supposed to do? You see, it's moments like these when we get stopped in our tracks that ask us to do some of the most important theological work we will ever do. even if in so doing it, we don't even say a word. It's easy to proclaim love and joy and peace when things are good, but when an EF5 tornado blows through your town, kills 24, does untold billions of dollars in damages, and leaves more than 1,000 people homeless, whatever we believe about life and meaning is truly put to the test. And it is in those moments when it becomes the most clear that sometimes the most important thing we can do when we encounter one of these moments, when we feel that he said what? Rising up within us. A moment when we're faced with the unexpected, the dangerous and the difficult is simply to stop. To stop and pay attention. Instead of fighting or rushing in with some poorly thought out and altogether shallow a response. The poem that was our reading this morning says a lot about that. Though we often think of ourselves as big and strong, masters of our own universe, capable of transforming all we see into our vision of it, when a tornado comes blasting through our town, our lives are discovered to be as fragile as that ladybird beetle with its lace wings, barely protected underneath the hard shell. We are but mortals here on an earth that was here long before we came and will be here long after we are gone. And it is reminders like this tornado and the others that ripped through Oklahoma this week that bring our lives into a tighter focus. They move us from the fuzzy places that we are usually living in to a kind of sharpness and engagedness. There are days when the fear of death is as ubiquitous as light, he wrote. It illuminates everything. Without it, I might not have noticed. Perhaps it was like that for you on Monday. I know it was for me. Maybe you found yourself glued to the radio or the TV or the live stream on the internet, waiting for the news to come through, afraid and focused on what you needed to know. A sort of sharpness and illumination to what we typically don't even pay attention to. I've lived through a tornado before. Julia was just 5 weeks old. And as we huddled in our basement and listened to the radio reporting that funnel cloud traveling all the way through the middle of our town, we sat there in fear and love, hoping for the best. That tornado was devastating, but not as bad as it could have been. It wasn't Joplin or more, but it was enough. Enough to leave me on edge in a way I had never been before. Now, every time a tornado is on the ground, I live in the mortal fear that it might be coming our way. I live in a second-story apartment. And when I called the office on Monday to find out where the safe place to be might be, they said, well, you could try Asbury across the street. Wasn't sure if it was a theological response or... But I have seen what tornadoes can do, and I know how fragile life can be. Moore is more than 100 miles away, but that storm system on Monday was headed in our direction, and I held my girls tight. And I waited to hear what the reporters would say. Over the next few days, friends from across the country were reaching out to make sure that we were okay. When you live in California, the difference between Oklahoma City and Tulsa is about as meaningful as the difference between Berlin and Frankfurt is to me. We're just sort of in the middle somewhere. But I was glad to hear from them, and I was glad to be able to say that we were okay. But I also know that we were lucky, and it just as easily could have been us. And many of us have found ourselves drawn into the stories all week long, waiting to hear what would be said. Getting caught up from the moment the news came rolling out. It looks like Briarwood Elementary and Plaza Towers Elementary have taken a direct hit. He said, what? Kids in a school that took a direct hit? What's going on? Is everyone safe? Could anyone be safe in a storm so powerful? We were stopped in our tracks and waiting for the news that Monday night out of Briarwood and Plaza Towers Elementary, and we knew things were not okay and more. Knowing that children are trapped tears at every fiber of our being. And on this Memorial Day weekend, when we remember those who have given their lives for this country, we remember, too, the heroism of the teachers in those schools. Teachers who gathered the children to the safest places they could, and then put themselves between the storm and those children, using their very bodies. Those teachers are heroes just as sure. And those kids were huddled down, as we are trained in these parts, huddled down with their hands over their necks against an interior wall, trying to protect their fragile bodies with whatever little protection that we can offer from a storm that picks up cars like an angry toddler with Hot Wheels and scatters them across the nation. And so it's not surprising in the wake of such pain and devastation and hurt and loss that people have been trying all week to make sense of it, bad theologies and all. And it's all gets started with what seems like the most normal kind of question in the world. Why did this happen? Why were these children killed? But in this month when we are considering the truth, I want to offer the possibility that the truth is not in the why, the truth is in the what. Asking why can be an incredibly important question. It can help us plan for the future, to do what we in fact did over the past decades and improve our storm tracking and warning systems, to adjust building codes, to provide a way that left the people in many cases with 10 or even 20 minutes notice that they were in the path of danger and destruction, and they should seek shelter where they were. Just this morning in the paper, I looked to see that there was a chart showing the most deadly tornadoes in the history of Oklahoma, and most of them were many decades ago, because we asked the question why, and we changed what we did. We get out the news. We tell people to shelter when there is a tornado on the ground. But even with all that, we are left asking still why. Because the why that cries out in our hearts is a deeper cry. It is a cry for meaning in a world that sometimes does not seem to care about us and doesn't seem to care about what we value most. A world where clouds can drop out of the sky and destroy everything we have, everything we've built, everything we know in the blink of an eye. And we are not the first to face these questions. They are as old as humanity itself. And so this week I found myself rereading a book in the Bible that gets short shrift in most churches. Ecclesiastes. It's not a book that's as relentlessly sure about a good outcome as much of the rest of the Bible. The equanimity that courses through it comforts me, though, and maybe it comforts you. The comfort in knowing that we are not alone in struggling with how to respond to a world that is so far beyond our control, even though we often act otherwise. Chapter 9, verses 11 and 12 were where I turned to, especially this week, when I wanted to ask the why and needed a reminding that no good answer would be found in that question. In those verses, the teacher, for that's who is known as the author in Ecclesiastes, the teacher writes, "I have seen something else under the sun. The race is not to the swift, and the battle to the strong, nor does food come to the wise, or wealth to the brilliant, or favor to the learned. But time and chance happen to them all. Moreover, no one knows when their hour will come. As fish are caught in a cruel net, or birds taken in a snare, so people are trapped by evil times that fall unexpectedly upon them." It would be easy to read such a perspective as one that says that all of life is a chance. And we know that's not true. And the teacher who wrote Ecclesiastes knew that too. He also knew, however, that there are parts of our life that are beyond our control. And this is the way it will always be. We are meant to take control of what we can, to prepare before the storm, and to live our lives and do our work. To love those whom we have been given to love. But even all of that can disappear when the floods fill the valley, when the ground quakes with the earth shifting beneath us. And as this week, when cold and warm fronts meet in a violent whirlwind that leaves nothing but destruction in its wake. What are we to do in such a world? I turn to this church and to this faith. It's times like this that remind me why I believe in the ministry that we do together. In this ministry that we share, both lay and professional alike. I finally accepted this call to professional ministry so many years ago that had been dogging me for years and years before it, at a funeral. It's not a particularly unique story. I think a lot of ministers would tell you that. A memorial service at the church that I grew up in, and a memorial service where no one felt the need to answer the question, why did Carl die? Where we could instead be together in our grief, without simple or easy answers. And instead, we could ask what we should do about the love that we hold for who he was. Where we would ask what we can do for the widow and the children and the grandchildren, the brothers and sisters who survive. A church where we can say that we too are sad, that we miss them deeply, and we have been blessed by their very presence in our midst. You see, I am in this work for no small part because I need to be a part of a church like this one, a church that knows the answer to the question, what shall we do? An answer that is as powerful today as when it was written down in that other great wisdom book of the ancient Judeans, the book of Job. Now, the book of Job is often and rightly remembered for being a book with chapter after chapter after chapter of Job's friends telling him that he should surely repent his sins, for whatever evil or ill has come to him, he earned it somehow, if he'd just figure out why. It's not a particularly friendly way to respond. But like the people of Moore, Job had done nothing to deserve what happened to him. And so I instead turn to a place that is often lost in the attention to that middle part of Job. That part instead at the very beginning. You see, in chapter 2, Job's friends have an answer, I think, for all of those who feel compelled to give a shallow answer, to try and explain away the loss and pain that we feel so that they don't have to feel vulnerable themselves. As the first answer, we might do as Job's friends did before they started to give him these weak and shallow answers. that did not reflect who he was or what he had done. You see, before they started to give him those answers, they came first and they sat. It's in chapter 2, and it says, when Job's 3 friends, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite, heard about the troubles that had come upon him, they set out from their homes and met together by agreement to go and sympathize with him and comfort him. When they saw him from a distance, they could hardly recognize him. They began to weep aloud, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads. Then they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. No one said a word to him, because they saw how great his suffering was. This week we have heard the cries of our neighbors, our friends, and family, and we have cried with them, and we have risen up. Members of this church have given of their time. The children of this church have given of their toys, giving away the ones they love to those who have nothing left. The ministers of this church have offered to provide memorial services for those who do not have a church, and also to support the ministers in Moore and in Oklahoma City who do the hard work of caring for their flocks in this time of loss and pain. And this morning we have gathered an offering, a collection to help those most vulnerable, the hard-working and undocumented members who live in every community around us, because so few sources of help are available to them. Our collection is a joint effort with Catholic churches, a collaboration that might indeed cause some of you to look at me and say, "He said what?" But we are proud to be able to work with the Catholic neighbors in this time of loss, because our churches also care about what they care about spreading this love beyond belief that we proclaim. And not just through our words, but through our actions, helping those who are most in need. It's a way of being I'll carry with me always. You might know that this is my last Sunday with you as your intern. Next week, this church will ordain me. And then at the end of July, I will be off with my family to spread the message of hope and love and faith and service that courses through the veins of this church each and every week. Love that knows when to speak and when to listen. Love that is the truth we know and live each day. Love that is with us even when we are stopped in our tracks. Love that is with us when we are too astonished by what we've heard to say anything at all. Love that brings us to attend to this world with attention we so rarely give it. And love that reminds us to consider first whether we are asked in the moment to ask why, and when the answers that are needed are not about why, but what shall we do now? May it be so, and amen.